It's great to be here in Mexico. Last international conference, like we all know, was in Jerusalem, Israel. And so I think as talking on private privacy cultures and around the world, I start with the Old Testament. Because in fact, as far as I know, the first reference to privacy can be found in the Bible, in chapter 24, the book of Bamidbar, better known as the book of Numeri of the Old Testament. The story is about Jacob, that's my name, who is the son of Isaac and brother of Esau. Please allow me to take you back in that time to a desert in the Middle East. Jacob, together with his family and many other relatives and followers, was traveling through the desert. At a certain moment, they decided to set up a camp in an unknown place. A non-Jewish prophet, Belial, wanted to curse the group of people dwelling in the desert by using his evil eyes. Though upon sight of the well-organized camp, the Spirit of God came over him, and he spoke the words, "Jacob, look how good your tents are, look how good your houses are, Israel." So instead of cursing the Jewish people, he blessed them. Now, according to two rabbis, Rabbi Khan and Rabbi Yaakov, Belial's words referred to the way the tents were arranged. Tents were placed in such a way that the entrances did not face one another. And that was done to ensure that the families could not see what was going on in each other's tents. By respecting each other's privacy, peace and harmony in society would be secured, according to Rabbi Khan and Rabbi Yaakov. Now, so also already in the culture of the Old Testament, well, privacy played apparently a role. Now, skipping a couple of centuries, thinking about the right to privacy and data protection in Western Europe today, it has been influenced enormously by development that took place in Europe, in France, and I'm referring to the French Revolution and the proclamation of the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen in 1789. The French Revolution placed the individual in the center of society, which up to that moment had not been done before. Subsequently, the views on legal rights and obligations also took the individual as starting point, both in France and Western Europe. The second part of the 20th century in Europe's history also influenced greatly the way we think about data protection. The state security services in Europe, Nazi Gestapo, East German Stasi, Romanian Securitate, build big databases with personal data of the residents, often based on information provided by fellow citizens. These databases were used for the execution of many of their horrifying plans and policies. And because of these experiences, European citizens became very much aware of the risks attached to the processing of personal data by governments and are, in general, still cautious about their use. Thus, it is not surprising that the member states of the European Union decided to recognize the right to data protection as a fundamental right for all its residents by including it in the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. When the Charter, already signed in 2000, became an integral part of the EU acquis, with the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty at the end of 2009, this fundamental right also became binding. Now, fundamental rights, of course, aim to protect fundamental interests. These are interests that are constitutive to the well-being of humans, regardless of what someone thinks a good life is. So fundamental right is inherent to being human, and it aims to protect the basic requirements for being a human being. In the tradition of Western Europe, a fundamental right is non-negotiable, not even by the individual itself, except under very specific circumstances. For example, public authorities can only infringe on the right to data protection when there is a legal basis to do so, and private parties can only infringe on the right to data protection if there is a demonstrable legitimate interest. In other cases, only express, informed and prior consent of an individual can allow the processing operation. Furthermore, the individual should also always have the possibility to withdraw his consent. Because data protection is a fundamental right in the European Union, opt-in is in most cases required. In other countries, however, opt-out would be sufficient because privacy and data protection are dealt within the framework of another field of law, mostly consumer law. The distinction between fundamental rights and consumer rights is that consumer rights are economic rights, notwithstanding the fact that this is a very important field of law in ensuring fair trade and fair practices vis-à-vis consumers. It does not aim at ensuring an individual's basic well-being. However, whether the right to data protection is a consumer right or a fundamental right, the great challenges posed to the right to data protection by the technological developments in recent decades is in any case the name of the game. What happens to one's personal data is most of the time not very clear. And even if information is provided and people are asked to indicate whether or not they consent to having data processed by ticking a box, people most of the time do not understand what they are consenting to because of the long and often legalistic text. I'm not going to go into explaining the behavioral advertising business. We probably are all aware of what is happening there, and that in companies places cookies or other devices on the computer of an individual without the individual knowing or consenting to it, to trace and collect information about all website views and clicks made by the individual. In Europe, this practice is only allowed if the company gets explicit consent from the individual after having provided all relevant information. According to the law, the right cause of action would be first to provide the information in an understandable language, after which the person chooses whether or not to consent to the processing. Now, recently, David Vladeck and myself, FTC and the Article 29 Working Party, have made, I think, an important step. First turn this page. An important step trying to closing the gap with regard to behavioral advertising. We publicly made clear that despite our legal differences, we all think effective user control is key. So, ladies and gentlemen, of course the differences in culture and between the legal systems can sometimes pose obstacles. But in my view, what really matters is the outcome, better protection of our personal data. And for that reason, with the data protection.
Let me begin by thanking Public Voice and the peerless Lily Cohen for holding this conference. And let me thank again our gracious host from the Mexican DPA. Let me just be clear, I'm speaking on my own behalf this morning, not on behalf of the Federal Trade Commission. I want to make 2 points. First is that culture matters, and it matters deeply. But second, and perhaps more importantly, privacy should not depend on or be culturally determined. So I agree that there are important cultural differences, and those differences matter. For example, I think there's a huge divide between the common law countries like the United States and some of the code countries like many of the European countries. I think the role courts play in society makes a big difference. We have a system where courts often are the decision makers on important policy questions. In other countries, it's the legislature or the administrative state. There are tons of other cultural factors: age, cultural norms, history. Jakob was talking about some of the history in Eastern Europe of state repression that depended on massive, unconsented to violations of human privacy. All of those factors matter. And I don't think we need to put them to one side. But culture alone can't drive decisions about what constitutes privacy or how privacy should be protected. And the United States is a good lens to examine that question from. There is no one dominant culture in the United States. We are as diverse, as heterogeneous as any society in the world. There are huge regional, religious, ethnic differences among us. And given the way the United States works, our dominant culture changes all the time. So it would be wrong to speak of the United States as having a culture. Moreover, I'm wary about the use of words like culture to build a regulatory framework on. Reference to cultural norms as a standard-setting device can enforce majoritarian norms at the expense of discrete and insular minorities. I'm not sure privacy should be put to a vote except when there's no alternative. So my views as a regulator is to presume that conceptions of culture are diverse, highly disuniform, and at times in conflict. Not all cultures agree about matters of privacy. And my job at the FTC is not to referee those disputes. I want to avoid getting entangled in those disputes. We try to put those cultural differences to one side. In the United States, the dominant regulatory goal is to preserve consumer choice. It is to build systems like the ones Jakob was talking about that empower consumers to maximize control over information they deem private. And online behavioral advertising is as good an example as any to talk about that. I'm beyond labels of opt-in and opt-out. All of us have clicked through a EULA without reading it because we know no one reads EULAs and has opted in. Is that informed consent? I don't think so. I don't think any of you who have clicked through an opt-in consent without bothering to read the page or 2 or 3 or 4 or a dozen of gobbledygook written by lawyers. One of my colleagues calls that word barf, which I think is a terrific expression. That's not consent. That's not meaningful consent, even though under opt-in regimes it would certainly qualify. Our submission is that you need to make sure, and this is why I think Jakob is right, that when you get down to the aspirational goals, even though our regulatory cultures could not be more dissimilar, we're a common law country, we have broad rules, and we build on them through other devices, through litigation, court decrees, regulatory initiatives. We don't believe in highly prescriptive rules, but we get to the same result by and large because we use enforcement and because we try to forge consensus. And so in the United States, we've been pushing very hard systems that we call do not track. These are systems that are designed to do exactly what Jakob is talking about. Put the control back in the hands of the consumer to decide to what extent he or she is willing to be tracked when the bargain is a more personalized, individual experience on the internet. But that's a decision that ought not to be made for the consumer by a corporation or by the government. That's a decision that the consumer ought to make. And frankly, we've made a lot of progress in the last year and a half. Many of the browser manufacturers are offering much more fine-tuned controls that allow people to control their experience on the internet. We've been working very hard with the ad agencies, the ad networks of the United States, for them to develop systems to give consumers the information and the controls that consumers need in order to make informed choices. So culture matters, but in terms of deciding how to protect privacy and deciding the even more basic question of what is privacy and why does it matter, I'm not sure that those kinds of decisions ought to drive the way we try to regulate. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Gracias por invitarme aquí. Don't worry, I'm not giving a speech in Spanish. I'm also speaking in my personal capacity today. It gives me a little bit more license to be a bit provocative. I've done a great deal of personal research. I'm very interested in East Asian concepts of privacy, so I'm very interested to hear Dr. Zhou's remarks. But in March of this year, a former law school classmate of mine, who now works for Yahoo's Business and Human Rights program, had a very interesting blog post and discussion with some Egyptian activists. What had happened was that an activist named Hossam el-Hamalawi had created a Flickr account, and Flickr is owned by Yahoo, and his account was called Pigipedia. And he created it to compile information on who he called Mubarak's Interior Ministry pigs. And he encouraged other activists to share photos that they took of police that they felt were abusing or harassing protesters. What he said in his blog is that a police officer cannot show up for a demonstration, beat the hell out of peaceful protesters, and then walk home and go out in his neighborhood with his family to have fun. He said they have to be exposed in front of their children, parents, neighbors, and peers. Their pictures have to be everywhere, from the internet to the streets. Now, Flickr took down these pictures in response to reports, because they have an abuse reporting function. And they took down the pictures. They told Mr. el-Hamalawi that he had violated Flickr's terms of use, which require that all your photographs that are posted there be your own. I would imagine that these rules are probably rooted primarily in copyright. But what was interesting to me is that this whole very thoughtful conversation went on without any reference to the word privacy or the concept of privacy. I had the same experience when I met some of these activists about a year before the Arab Spring took place. They came to Washington on a trip sponsored by Freedom House. And I asked them about privacy and whether they knew anything about the differences between the European and the US approaches. And they expressed that they didn't really care, and that they needed basic laws first, and they don't care about privacy, and their government doesn't care about anyone's privacy but its own. They said the government's interest in privacy is trying to prevent us from finding out what they're doing. But these are the same activists who just a few months after the Arab Spring were storming the offices of the Egyptian Al-Mandala, which is the secret police, because they wanted to see copies of their files. They wanted to see copies of the secret files that this surveillance entity had compiled on all the activists. So it seems to me that they do care quite a bit about privacy. They didn't know that they cared. And I've seen a similar phenomenon go on with regard to East Asian cultures. We commonly say things like, well, the Japanese have no privacy, the Chinese have no tradition of privacy, they don't have a word for privacy. There was a very influential book written about Japan in 1946 by a woman named Ruth Benedict, who had never visited Japan. And she said that, well, the Japanese have no privacy, the whole world knows what you're doing if you're a part of this community. And I find it interesting. I think when Western observers look at other cultures and think that there's no tradition of privacy, it seems to me that what they are missing is the rule of law, a reliance on individual rights. I think we in the West, when we don't see these two elements in a culture, we think that it has no privacy. And I think that's wrong, and I think there's a way to remove the issue of rule of law or rights-based thinking and remove individualism and still see a tradition or a notion of privacy that's quite universal. There's a social psychologist named Erwin Altman who published a number of works in the 1970s, and he conceived of privacy not as a right, and certainly not as a method of being left alone, but actually a dynamic process of interpersonal boundary regulation in which openness and closeness take on equal importance. And he actually conveyed this concept using the classic Yijing symbol of the yin and yang. And if you read some of his works, he really opens your eyes to the different types of privacy mechanisms that can exist in a society that are not legal. A perfect example is politeness. Any American I've ever met who spent significant time in Japan will tell you, oh, the Japanese, they're so polite. I guess we're rude. We don't often think of politeness as a privacy mechanism, but in fact it is a distancing mechanism. I'm trying to learn Spanish, and I always struggle with when to say usted and when to say tú. And we don't have the two different forms of you in English. And the use of usted itself has a distancing effect. You actually conjugate the verb in the same way that you would to a third person. So, we don't think about how these societal factors and simple rules like etiquette can create an interpersonal distance where there might not be a law, or where there may not be physical proximity, where there may be thin walls in crowded cities. Another example of a privacy mechanism, arguably, is the hijab or the niqab. There's an anthropologist named Fadwa al-Jundi who talks about women's veiling in contemporary Arab culture as first and foremost a privacy mechanism, so a way of maintaining space, personal space to one's body. It allows a woman to be present in a public space and still experience privacy. She can see without being seen, in the tradition of Bentham's panopticon. So, you know, again, openness and closeness work in this interdynamic process. When a woman wears a hijab, she is simultaneously concealing, but she's also expressing. She's expressing Muslim identity. So on the one hand, if we force women to wear a veil, we can perceive this as oppressive, but when we force women to not wear a veil, women can experience that as oppressive as well. So, you know, I might suggest a universal rule that men simply stop telling women what to wear, but again, these are my personal views. So I don't necessarily see a correlation between individualism or collectivistic social organization and privacy. I think every society finds a way to regulate those interpersonal boundaries in their own way. What tends to set collectivistic societies apart is not the value placed on privacy, but the value placed on legal mechanisms. So when you have a collectivistic social order, and I'm not overgeneralizing about particular societies because I think each of us interact in individualistic or collectivistic manners depending on the circumstances. I think for starters the US military is quite a collectivistic society. But in a collectivistic society, there's more of a tendency towards mediative solutions, more of an emphasis on maintaining harmony, finding a solution that works for the group, less of an emphasis on finding an objective outside criteria and an individual right that must be exercised. So I think those are some of the differences. And the other difference I see between culture is that privacy is ultimately about trust. And the entities that we trust, generally, we will trust more with our personal data. There's a very interesting study written by a scholar based in Chinese Taipei in which she compared Dutch, American, mainland Chinese, and Chinese Taipei-based computer users and asked, what kinds of data are you willing to share with different types of websites? And she found that the Americans were much more comfortable with the commercial websites, but deeply suspicious of sharing personal data with the government. And for the Dutch, this was almost completely reversed. The Dutch were deeply suspicious of the big Amazon.coms, the Googles, these types of entities, but comparatively more trusting of the government. So I think that's where culture does have an influence. And if there's a message to be taken from that, is that you know, maybe we can harmonize some global standards. Maybe there are ways that we can achieve greater interoperability so that the consumer has a consistent expectation of privacy as their data moves through different systems. But I think in order to do that, we have to be more open to different enforcement mechanisms and to accept that not all of them are legal and that different enforcement mechanisms will work better in different cultures because the legal mechanisms can interact with the extra legal mechanisms. And so, you know, I think one model for doing this is the APEC cross-border privacy rules, which were just finalized. I think they should be announced in mid-November. And what I saw was, on the one hand, yes, a reliance on regulatory authority, real legal authority, but on the other hand, a real openness to different types of enforcement mechanisms, reliance on private accountability agents, and more of an exploration of interoperability between regimes rather than suggesting that everyone has to have the same approach. And it's an impressive array of different philosophies of enforcement that came out in the quite fascinating discussion that we had in San Francisco. So I'll leave it there because I'm very interested to hear what some of my other co-panelists have to say about my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to attend this conference. And I always think it's a very complex issue to talk about privacy from the perspective of cultural difference. As Ms. Lara just mentioned, in China, and also to my knowledge, in Japan and in Korea, in East Asian countries, historically, there was no such concept or ideology or terminology of privacy. That is true. And it does matter. Well, you don't have this traditional culture of privacy. The general public's perception of privacy has more or less been affected by this history. So today in China, we we might have the worst situation of privacy protection. You know, in Mexico City, I dare not to take up the phone call, because normally there will be some spam, some unrelated telephone calls from the business promoter or whatever sources. So you take up the phone call, you cost. The cost or not, the international long distance. It's very common even in China. Everyone, when you bring the telephone, you always have some spam. So that's the situation. That means the privacy protection is not well protected. One reason for that is that we don't have the law yet, so we have been working on that. But on the other hand, it also has something to do with the general public's perception of privacy, or the people's tolerance to the usage of your personal information. Because if you don't have this perception, you don't have this ideology, some of people, they will tolerate this kind of usage by promotions or whatever purpose. So from this perspective, culture does matter. So when you design the institution, when you promote the legal rules, you have to take this into consideration. So what kind of mechanism you design, what kind of enforcement would be more useful or more effective, not only in the area of privacy protection, but also in other areas as well. It is quite complex to explain why there have been this kind of differences, why there has not been privacy conception in East Asia or in China. Ms. Lara gave her explanation, individualism or liberalism versus collectivism. Also, there could be many other different explanations for this situation. So this is one point, I agree with that. But on the other hand, we also think, especially in the internet age or in the information age, the convergence is the trend. You know, in China, not only we didn't have concept of privacy, we didn't have other concepts as well, such as constitution, human rights, cooperation, court, or etc.
That doesn't have a starting point that privacy is a fundamental right. Treaty of Lisbon calls the privacy a fundamental right. It has been a long battle to get that treaty accepted, and I don't think that anyone would want in Europe to go and change that. So it's not completely your answer, but let me close this remark by saying, and David mentioned it as well, of course there's differences between opt-out and opt-in, for example, to be more precise. But if in the end we could agree, all of us, that effective user control is the name of the game, and work together to have that effective user control organized in a way that suits the different cultures, I think we're getting much further than staying apart in our sort of popcorn. That is rightly a cultural one, but let's face it, without each other, we're not going to get this privacy done.
Thank you. David, do you want to give other remarks or also answer the question to you? That would be great.
I think I'll answer the question that you gave to me and respond briefly to Jakob. You know, there are cultural differences that are fundamental in the way we approach law. I think the difference between common law countries and civil law countries comes really to a head when you're talking about the ways, the means by which we try to achieve the same goals. European laws are very prescriptive. That's not It's just not the way the U.S. system works. Our system is dependent on broader legal commands backed up by very intensive enforcement. And so, you know, I don't think there's really very large differences between the EU and the United States when it comes to the aspirational goals. If you hear what Jakob wants and I want, there's not really much that separates us. There is a vocabulary problem that separates us because, you know, to Americans, fundamental rights are rights guaranteed by our Constitution. Now, what's interesting about that is that privacy rights are deeply embedded in our Constitution, but they're privacy rights principally against our government. You know, when I go to Europe and I have to fill out a form that's immediately turned over to the police, I wonder, what is Jakob talking about when he talks about fundamental rights? No one asked me whether I had to fill out the form. No one asked me whether I objected to the form being given to the police. Americans wouldn't stand for that. Because
the Americans state that information without me knowing it.
No, that's not, I mean, we get into that, but that's not what happens. And so, the question about what constitutes fundamental gets back to the discussion about what we're talking about in terms of cultural norms. I mean, it's easy to say that a right is fundamental. It's hard to back it up. A fundamental right that isn't enforced vigorously isn't much of a right. And so the question really comes to how you get, what sort of means you choose to get to the end. I think that if you take a step back and look at the goals of both regimes, there's very little distance between us. If you look at the way we try to achieve those goals, I think there are differences that are driven by culture. And I think it'll take time to overcome that. That's why I think Peter was right this morning, that it will be very difficult, not impossible, but it's going to take time before we come to norms, global norms that we can all subscribe to and all work for. In terms of setting out our goals, though, I don't think we're that far apart. And I think that if you look at the privacy reports that the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce have issued in the last couple of years, and match them against, for example, the recommendations of the Article 29 Working Group, again, there's not much difference between us. There may be vocabulary differences. I just reject completely the idea that opt-out, opt-in, that difference has any meaning in current technology. I think there's a huge philosophical point to it, which we agree with. It's a matter of giving consumers control. The means by which they exercise that control, the technologists, are going to design ways around either system unless we are vigilant and we enforce. In any event, again, I do think culture matters. That's why I started with that point. Culture matters because it affects the ways we achieve goals. But I don't think it necessarily defines the goals. And I think that when it comes to the goals of the DPAs, I think we're very much in sync. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.